quite some time ago, there was either a 60 Minutes or one of these sort of like nightly news programs. I'm not sure if it was Maury Povich or something like that, and I really wish that I could find what it is. But it was a story called The Perfect Corpse. The Perfect Corpse. And I was pretty, it could have been 20, 30 years ago when this particular program aired. And I'm pretty sure maybe I was in my teens, because I remember I wasn't the size that was portrayed of the person who was who they were saying is the perfect corpse in the program. And it was about, because I remember very specifically they described him as a 180-pound bodybuilder. And to me, that, I kind of thought that was big. I never really focused on people's body weight before. And from the photos they showed of him, I don't think they said what his height was, but he looked pretty muscular, pretty built up. He did look like a bodybuilder for what they were saying at 180 pounds. And so to me that was a big guy. That was a bodybuilder. So I do know, because I didn't reach 180 pounds until I was about 20, 21, 22. It took me a while to get to that weight, because throughout, I even remember in my junior and senior year in high school, I was on the cross-country team, swim team, wrestling team, all that. I was wrestling at 152, I think was the weight class. But I was, around 145, 150 pounds. And so I wrestled at 3 weight classes, because sometimes we didn't have enough, because I only wrestled my senior year in high school. And then I was automatically made one of the co-captains, because for some reason I was just through sheer ferocity and endurance, I was pretty good. So it was myself and this guy Keith Rohan. We were co-captains of the wrestling team. And so one of the interesting things that would happen was because it was varsity wrestling, and because sometimes there were spots open, because also Keith was the same weight that I was, and so there weren't, sometimes on the other team there weren't 2 people wrestling at 152. And so sometimes what often would happen is that as long as you didn't go overweight and they weren't checking exact weight, and my coach Michael Schrock, he knew, kind of little tricks of the trade, that sometimes as long as if they put you on the scale and as long as you didn't go over the weight, they would just set it at, for example, I think it was 160 or 160, something like that. And then the next one up was like 171. So it was like 152, 160, and then 171. I think that's how it went. But, and so he would put me on the scale sometimes for 160, and as long as it didn't go over, then I would qualify to wrestle in that weight class. And sometimes I even went up to 171 or whatever it was. So those are the 3 weight classes I wrestled in, and I think it was 150, 160, and 171. I'm not exactly sure the numbers, but roughly you could say 150, 160, and 170 is what I wrestled as. So I was never any bigger than that or heavier than that while I was in high school. And so I think I even remember probably seeing this, I don't know what you would call those, like, those TV news programs or investigative journalism programs. And anyway, like I said, it was called The Perfect Corpse. And it was about this guy who was a 180-pound bodybuilder. He looked like he might have been like Italian or Hispanic, or at least just an ethnic-looking Caucasian male. He didn't look like he was your typical, Norwegian type of, he wasn't blonde, blue eyes. He had dark hair, olive-colored skin, I think. I don't remember, but these are the kind of things I remember somewhat. And so, and it was because he died from maybe a heart condition or some other issue, something else happened to him, but because he was using steroids. And So that was really the whole issue why it was called a perfect corpse, because even though, you know, he looked really good, I mean, the photos they showed of him, I mean, it reminded me of the kind of ideals that I was striving for when I would see, you know, like He-Man and other, you know, comic book characters and things like that. They had these very well-drawn bodies, and it was something that I aspired to look like. And I remember once when I was in Fort Lauderdale High School for my freshman and sophomore year, there was this guy named Steve Samdom, and then and another guy, Stuart Simpson, and they were, you know, they were already lifting or whatever. And I remember very clearly, Stuart Simpson said, he was like, "Yeah, man, you'd look good thick," meaning, you know, if I put on muscle. And then after my sophomore year, I dropped out of high school for a year, and I went to California. Well, actually, I went to California first, and I got into some issues out there, ended up for 60 days in an adolescent psychiatric unit, and then a foster home for 3 days, and then decided to go back home to Florida where my family was. And this was all of my own doing. I orchestrated the whole thing. But when I got back, because of where my father lived, I was enrolled in Dillard High School, and I just didn't get along very well with the kids there. It was like going to Everglades Middle School all over again. It was because, like, you know, my parents are Caribbean immigrants. They're from Trinidad and Tobago, so, you know, I'm mixed with like Indian and African and stuff like that. So I have dark skin, I'm brown skin, and, you know, people would probably classify me or think that I'm black, right? And so, but what was crazy is because my mother was raised in England, and she had a British accent somewhat. You know, a lot of it times it came out, but it was kind of non-distinct. And my father had a very thick, you know, rural Trinidadian accent. I mean, he grew up on like a farm, and he was like, you know, could be considered like a Trinidadian bush doctor, you know, the kind of guy who used herbal medicine and natural healing and these kind of things. And so I just chose, I don't know how it happened, but I just took just the way that I speak now, a very neutral type of, you know, diction, the way that my pronunciation, enunciation, everything was just, I practiced to be, even though I do my best to not mumble, because I have a tendency for some reason to trip over my words a lot. And so I just started to practice being very careful about how I speak so I can be clear, especially since I started writing, and then reading aloud, doing spoken word poetry and everything like that since I was very young. So I had to be very clear to transmit, you know, what I was creating. But the problem with that was when I first moved to Florida in 1990, it was in the middle of my 6th grade year. And then I ended up at Everglades Middle School. It was a predominantly black school, just like Dillard High School that I ended up back in when I came back from California. And the problem was that a lot of the southern black kids there, for some reason, they had this issue with, like, you got that good hair, and why you talk white, and all this other stuff like that I had no idea what the hell they were talking about. I had never been introduced to that kind of nonsense. And so, and here's a little a quality aside here, is what's really funny is that a lot of black people who act this way, they do very strange things to other people of color, right? Like if you speak a certain way, or if you don't wear brand names, and don't realize that how that's like the biggest, you know, trick of the verifiers, who are the showrunners of the global brainwashing agenda, right? And like I remember once I even I did some community college classes at Los Angeles Valley College, and I wore these retro Nike Air shoes that I had gotten directly from Nike themselves, because I was working for a woman who was doing the run of the show at something called Nike Battlegrounds, which was one of these you know, street basketball tournaments that was in part, you know, it was I suppose like directly sponsored by Nike, because it was called Nike Battlegrounds. And I remember I met John Sally there, because I was working directly for the woman who was running the show. And I remember I even met this artist and got his music. It was called Click, the Super Latin. So my point is that Nike gave me a full outfit, like this warm-up outfit. It was a long sleeve, zipper up type of thing, and you could like take the top and roll it up and it fit inside of itself like a little pouch. Like, so it was like this whole warm-up thing, these pants and everything, and it was just like retro classic Nike stuff. But the point, when I went to Valley College, there was a bunch of black kids standing around, and they saw me walking by, and they're like, oh, look at those Nike Airs, they ain't even got no air. Right? And again, I'm making the point that this is a part of this whole brainwashing agenda. It's like, I mean, even if you do a little bit of research, there's a lot of people who would question anybody's loyalty to Nike, or even making fun of Nike, or even caring about it, when there's been so many accusations. And I don't know if any of the stuff that I ever hear about any company is true, right? But about them having like sweatshops in Indonesia and, exploiting, developing nations and all this other stuff like that. And just, even other very questionable practices against marginalized communities, which, African American, black, and other so-called minority communities are. And so, this is just how wicked and pervasive this kind of, rhetoric and this stupidity, how deep it runs. But back to Dillard High School, right? So my whole point was, wow, this is a great tangent, but I dropped out of that school. I left and just decided not to go because of the way that I was treated by other people of color, specifically the people in the black community there, because of how I spoke, the music that I listened to. By then I was deeply entrenched into extreme metal, and I even very quickly I was an anchor for like 2 days. They had like a school news program that was broadcast over the whole school. They read like the morning news and just different things like that. And so people just were immediately bothering me about this stuff. And previously all throughout, I remember when I was in Fort Lauderdale High School before, I would constantly be getting jumped by groups of people. Like, the least amount of people I got jumped by once that I remember was 4 people. And so I was constantly fighting. And unfortunately, they were mainly other people of color, black kids. It was like the Haitian kids, the African American. It was crazy, right? And so I dropped out of Dillard High School because I was like, I'm not dealing with this stuff. I'm going to end up just crushing people. Because one of the things that I'm glad to say that was a very prominent characteristic about me is that I was only bullied once by any individual or group. Like, people tried me one time and then they just decided, yeah, we're not doing that again to that guy. That skinny kid with the glasses is a monster. And so it wasn't because I'm super badass or even knew very much about martial arts then. It's just that I was, like my mom said, I would Hulk out. Like, she constantly compared me to the Incredible Hulk, and plus it was one of my favorite TV shows on television. And speaking of the Hulk, Lou Ferrigno, bodybuilder, and back to this show called The Perfect Corpse. So this guy died from some issues from using steroids, and that was what the whole show was about. And so one of the things that I think that may be one of the reasons why, even though it was offered to me several times, and also various other kinds of supplements, is why I've tended to stay away from them, even to the point now where I very rarely take any supplements or even vitamins. And I'm glad that I have taken that stance also, because another thing I don't do is I don't ever take any prescription or over-the-counter medications at all, of any kind, for any reason. And so now, sometimes I may take vitamin supplements. Like, my sister gave me some like black seed oil or something, and sometimes I'll take, every once in a while, I'll take creatine, and like the one that I have, I think I got it from this place called Publix, and if you look at it, the ingredients just say creatine. That's it. There's nothing else. No fillers, no colors, no flavors, nothing. But it's just not a practice for me. And many of the other things that I've learned about just pharmaceutical companies and their interests and, you know, the side effects, or what they call adverse reactions and things like that. It just, to me, has seemed not to be worth it for any of that stuff. So that was one of those things that really stuck with me for all of these years, you know, now being 48 years old, and I'm really very, very glad for it. And the reason why I bring this up is because one of the things that I've made a dedicated study in my life is healthy living and self-defense. And I declared at least almost 20 years ago, it was before that, but I have the website exercisingyourmind.com that says, wealth attraction research, great health is the truest of all wealth. And so all those years ago, I decided that I was going to see how this plays out. And there's been, you know, lots of pushback. Hold on, there's a really cool army code that I got. Okay. All right. So, and there's some pushback that I've heard about, and just really ridiculous kind of stupid things that people say, where because of the fact that I abstain from so many things, and I've also been straight edge for years now, meaning that I don't use any kind of substances like drugs or alcohol, no vapes, no tobacco, nothing like that. You know, every once in a while, like I said, I might take some creatine, and I drink coffee. But there's things that you'll hear people say, oh, my grandfather smoked and drank every day of his life and lived till da-da-da-da. Well, my dad, too. As long as I've been alive, I know my dad has been technically an alcoholic. I mean, he drinks till he's drunk and smokes cigarettes, and he's 83 years old right now, still walking around, still being active. So, I mean, I understand what people are saying, but there are other issues that he's talked about that could probably be alleviated if he wasn't doing those things for all those years. And he's also probably saved a good deal of his health and vigor because of the fact that he is pretty much, with everything else, is all natural substances. You know, he doesn't order, you know, junk food or do takeout or anything like that. So, you know, there's a balance. But a lot of people aren't like that. A lot of people will drink, smoke, do drugs, and eat a bunch of junk food and pile on a bunch of other stuff in their body. So you'll hear people say just ridiculous things like that. Well, my so-and-so does this and that. And, you know, there's nuance to everything. And there's so many different reasons why people, and I don't know what these people are telling me, because I don't know what the quality of life of their grandpa or uncle or whoever it is they're talking about, right? So, but wealth attraction research, great health is the truest of all wealth. And what I've realized, and what this really comes down to, is the understanding that, in fact, a lot of those things are not needed. And this extends to, I see a lot of people who talk about taking, TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, or sometimes I think it's called HRT, hormone replacement therapy in general, right? So would it be called estrogen replacement therapy in women? I don't know, right? But either way, that, you know, people like I've heard Joe Rogan talk about it a lot, or various other celebrity podcasters or speakers and things like that talk about taking, you know, and they have a doctor who gives it to them in the right doses and, you know, medically and all this and that, and say that it's helped them so much. But then you'll see, for example, and look, I'm not a person who's against people, right? There's a difference between being against, speaking against, and speaking about, right? I'm just simply speaking about. Like, people, you can do whatever the hell you want. I'm simply talking about success in a specific area, and it's success with not having to deal with certain, you know, ailments and issues that people usually have because of certain lifestyle choices. So where did this map take me? Where am I going? Okay, I don't know if this makes sense. I've never actually been here before. This is interesting. All right, well, okay, I think there's a way through. I didn't really know that. I've always come to this, there's a grocery store over here, and I've been here before, but I didn't know there were apartments back over here. All right, so, but Joe Rogan, like, he drinks alcohol on his show, he smokes weed, he does mushrooms, other things like that, and you know, smokes cigars, and just different things like that, right? And then I've seen some photos of Joe Rogan shirtless that he's posted online, and other people have reposted and whatever. And there's like some issues, right? There's like stuff that you look at, and it just, like, there's like stuff in around his abdomen, and it's like really wide there, and like there's like lumpy stuff. It looks like there's something crawling around under his skin. Again, I'm not making fun of. I'm observing, right? Again, like, there's a difference, and I've spoken about this before, about speaking about something and speaking against, right? And I'm just speaking about it. These are observations. And, you know, there are things about almost everybody that I like, and some things that I disagree with, right? But just because I disagree with some things that people do and or say doesn't mean I hate them or have anything necessarily against them. Just that there are things that I don't do, just like anything else, right? Everybody, you don't do certain things. But I do have to take a quick break to drop this off, and I'll be back in a second. Okay, and so there's a couple things going on here with this monologue. Is something that I must continue to communicate, which is self-defense. And so that, just keep in mind that this is in the line where I'm going. So there are various people who talk about, you know, taking exogenous testosterone or supplemental hormones because they're getting past a certain age and so on and so forth. And they claim that it helps them. And some people, from what I know, I don't really look that much into it, but some seem to be, at least superficially on the surface, it might be working for them better than others. However, my deeply educated suspicion is that when people do have issues, like I said, where their bodies look all lumpy and nappy and just like weird blotchy things happening, is because of the other things that people are not abstaining or refraining from, which are alcohol and tobacco and various different kind of drugs. And I'm pretty sure that, you know, the conspiracy theorist in me thinks that the verifiers have, you know, we've gotten to the point where cannabis has been legalized in so many places and so readily available that it's been tainted. And, you know, issues that were going on with cannabis before are starting to crop up now. It's contaminated. The strains have been engineered in certain ways. Like, it's not what it used to be. But that's another conspiracy for another day. All in all, the understanding is that so I look at self-defense in a more general way, as well as the very specific way that most people think about it, right? So many people think of self-defense as basically a very specific aspect of fighting, right? Where you have to fight off an attacker. You're defending yourself. And a lot of that comes down to, most people think of it as being martial arts, which is of or pertaining to war, right? These skills that you would use during wartime, because when, you know, warring factions long ago, they didn't necessarily have, or not necessarily, but they definitely didn't have the weapons that we have today. If you go all the way back to, you know, primitive humans and proto-humans and things like that, the most weapons they had were, you know, sticks and rocks and sharpened ends of sticks and sharpened rocks and things like that, right? So there were blunt objects and stabbing objects and you know, whipping, beating, you know, throwing, stuff like that. You know, there were no guns, there were no bow and arrow, everything yet. So martial arts, the empty hands, the karate is an ancient thing, right? The unarmed combat, the hand-to-hand combat. And that's what most people think of in martial arts, right? Is that fighting without weapons. Just like why we have mixed martial arts is such a popular sport. It's two people getting in a ring and fighting each other without weapons, you know. And so we mostly think of self-defense in those terms of hand-to-hand combat. And so there, of course, that's one aspect of it, and one aspect of self-defense, which is, you know, a very specific niche within martial arts a lot of times. Although self-defense can also be things like learning how to use firearms and various other weapons, pepper spray, all these other things like that, and home defense, so on and so forth. But a more general category, and one that I established, you know, so many years ago as well, like one of my first websites that went online is hypnoathletics.com, and it says hypnoathletics is exercising your mind towards universal harmony and spiritual wisdom through healthy living and self-defense. Although I think on the website now it probably says something about metaphysical hypnosis and yoga and something else. I don't know. Even though I publish on there from time to time, I don't really look at the titles anymore that I put on some of these sites, and because it doesn't really matter. It's just all stuff from me just blurbing about stuff. But that's the point. Healthy living and self-defense. And healthy living is, in general, a form of self-defense. So if you take somewhat of a radical view of life on Earth as being a very hostile environment, but it's been made hostile by other human beings, and, you know, either intentionally or as artifacts of the very stupid, polluting type and toxic byproducts of things that humans do, you can basically look at healthy living, clean living, as a form of self-defense against a hostile environment. So, you know, one of the, you know, a blog that I published on that same site many years ago was called Becoming Superhuman Through Toxin Elimination and Nutrition. And the idea is that the way to remain as healthy as you possibly can is not by adding supplements or steroids or hormones or other kind of medications or surgeries or all of these other things. But instead, the way to be as healthy as you possibly can is actually finding ways to abstain from or to exclude or eliminate toxic chemicals from your body, and as much as you possibly can. And one rationale for this is the fact that, again, in this hostile environment of Earth that we live in, where there's so many byproducts of human endeavors, we are already being impinged upon and bombarded by so many different molecules and chemicals in the environment that are not exactly safe for human beings. Things that get on our skin and into our bloodstream, things that we eat, things that we drink. A lot of it is simply by making the choice to consume those things is actually decreasing our ability to function at the most optimum level possible. We already have enough of it. Just one of the very main common things is the fact that people drive cars. Combustion engines burn fuel, and it releases chemicals in the environment that are not good for humans, right? And we're taking these things in small doses, but for example, if a person gets locked in a space that doesn't have any ventilation with the engine of a car running and the exhaust filling the area, eventually it will poison that person to death. They will asphyxiate. They will literally suffocate to death, because in place of oxygen, you now have this other toxic chemical from the exhaust of the vehicle. And so we know that carbon monoxide is poisonous. It comes from the exhaust of vehicles. And so a lot of things are like that in our environment, that if we were to subject ourselves to concentrated doses of these things, it would kill us. You can eat too much sugar, we know, and it'll make you sick. You can eat too much food of any kind, And it can make you sick, not just for the fact that like you can literally rupture your organs because just too much, but just you can get way too much protein, like way too much fat all in one take, and it can make you sick and even kill you. We even know that there's something called hyponatremia, which is if you drink way too much water, it basically drowns your cells in your body. You can die from drinking too much water, right? So the point is that everything in moderation, but there are also compounding effects or compounding effects of chemical reactions. We think, most of the time people just think of chemistry from labs and classrooms where they see beakers and Bunsen burners and petri dishes, right? And then I know petri dishes are usually biology, cell cultures, I know. But that's what we mostly think about in like science and labs and chemistry. But we don't usually think of our bodies as also being a very rich chemical environment, when in fact it is. And in fact, when we ingest things into our bodies, there are chemical reactions that are happening, some of them that are not so good. I mean, some of the clearest examples of this are all of the adverse reactions or the bad side effects that can happen from medications. That is very clear from the commercials, that at the end you have this very rapid, citing of all of these potential side effects, which most likely they're not even just potential, but they're certain. I know for a fact people that I know personally who take psychiatric drugs, and all of the symptoms that are claimed that can happen with the psychiatric drugs happen to everybody that I know who are on these psychiatric drugs. Things like tardive dyskinesia, which is a neuroleptic induced Parkinsonism, meaning a psychiatric drug Parkinson type disease where they have tics and palsies that sometimes are uncontrollable and sometimes can become permanent. A permanent disfigurement from psychiatric drugs. There's neuroleptic malignant syndrome, in which their body can't defend itself properly against external. It basically lowers their immune system, and on and on. There's so many various different things, all kinds of metabolic syndromes that happen. There's liver and kidney damage, and just on and on and on, right? So we know that with everything that we're putting in our body, there are thresholds. But what we don't look at is a lot of times, like something that's been frowned upon a lot in psychiatry is what's known as polypharmacy. And polypharmacy simply means when you mix various different drugs together. Like one time I was somewhat outraged when somebody that I knew was being prescribed all at the same time. They were being prescribed Abilify, buspirone, and clozapine, and a beta blocker all at the same time. And two of those, Abilify and clozapine, are both antipsychotics. They're both atypical antipsychotics, and there's no reason for a person to be on both of those for long term. And their system was definitely toxic. They were showing jaundice. There was yellowing under their eyes. Their tongue was twitching. They were like zoned out like a zombie all the time. They were shuffling when they were walking. They had excess weight gain, like all these other things. And sure enough, when they came off of all of the other medications except for one and lowered the dose of the one, they completely changed. They looked like a completely different human being. They dropped a whole bunch of body weight, were more alert and aware, were more able to function, and so on and so forth. Like just so many different things changed about their life. But this is not, about psychiatric drugs. I'm using that as an example of something that I know from my experience, that I've actually seen and have done extensive research into, because there were people close to me, people that I knew that were dealing with these things. So, but the point that's being made here is the fact that when you remove substances, you tend to fare better because your system gets overloaded with things. And this is what causes a lot of the problems. And so when I mentioned polypharmacy, it was for a reason, because this is what's happening in our bodies. There are sometimes, because of research that's done, some very clear issues of mixing various different drugs with each other. And also there are some drugs that you can't take for example, and also eat grapefruit, because if you eat grapefruit, for example, with some of these atypical antipsychotics, some of the molecules in there occupy some of the same receptors and some of the same metabolic pathways, and so then the body is not able to get rid of the drug as quickly, and it stays in their body longer and causes more toxic problems and things like that. So we know that there are things that you can't take together because of the reaction, the biochemical reactions that will happen. And so, but a lot of this stuff is not directly studied with a lot of the already everyday pollutants that come in our bodies, like microplastics, the carbon monoxide from the exhaust from cars, and all of the other things that come out of them. We used to have lead in our fuel, and there's still some inside some of the fuel systems, and on and on and on, just with all of the pollution, all of the toxins, people secondhand smoke. So many of these things that are going on, and this in a way is a form of polypharmacy, or at the very least polychemistry, that has no direct and ongoing research of how these things are happening inside the human body. And then we wonder where some of these setbacks and these things are coming from. And so the main point in understanding to take away here is that you have zero need, right? And really not need. That's just kind of not the best way to communicate. You basically don't have a lot of space, or a lot of. There's not a whole lot of what would be the best way to term this? You don't really have a whole lot of room to work with. A whole lot, yeah. So your threshold is already decreased. So you don't have a lot of room to play with your health by adding a bunch of other stuff to your body. And it's one of the reasons why people's health declines so rapidly in comparison to people like myself who don't do those extra substances, because my body's already fighting off all this stuff in the environment. I'm already fighting off the exhaust, the secondhand smoke, people coughing and sneezing and being sick around me, the plastics, the BPAs that I touch on receipt paper and everything, like on and on, right? Handling money, like just the electromagnetic smog or electromagnetic pollution that people always talk of is a potential, right? That comes from our devices, the one that I'm using right now to make this recording with. So why in any rational way would I want to decide that I'm going to continue to add other things to my system that are only going to overload and add to my biological burden? It's only going to add to the stress that my body has to take on in order to keep itself as healthy as possible. Right? Think about that. And a lot of analogies I like to use have to do with weight, right? But if you, like, it's one of the things that I had discovered a long time ago about going to the gym and lifting weight, which I really don't do that much of. And it's amazing how fit you can stay without actually using external weights, especially if you're healthy. I'm healthy, so I know that there are reasons for it, and I've trained lots of clients with weights, and I have a very specific understanding of that. But I do calisthenics, so I do pull-ups sometimes, and I do a whole lot of running, jumping, climbing, squatting, rolling, flipping, and things like that. So, and I do lift a lot of things, and I do it in a certain way, but it's not in the gym. It's just in my everyday life and through the work that I do. But if you were to, for example, have a steep cliff or mountain or hill that you wanted to climb, and you put weights around your wrists and ankles, and then put on a backpack, or you're just wearing a weighted suit, and you were climbing up that incline, and the difference is, if you took all of that weight off, would be astounding of how different it would feel. So if you trained wearing that weight and climbing up this incline, and then a time, let's say you were training for a competition, and then a competition came for you to do the same thing, but now you don't have the weight on. So imagine if you were to beat the record time with all the weight off. Imagine how much faster you would be without. You'd basically be flying up this incline. And I have also a similar experience in my life where I wear about 20 pounds of stainless steel chains on my body most of the time. I have an ID wallet that I wear around my neck, and I have 2 stainless steel chain bracelets. And these are industrial chains that I got from the hardware store, and then a much bigger one that I wear as a belt. And sometimes if I get tired when I'm training, I'll take it off so that I can make sure that I don't fall on my head when I'm doing backflips. You know, sometimes it doesn't cause me a problem, especially depending on how if I do a round off first or give some momentum before I do the backflip. But like today I was at the park and I did a half moon kick followed by a round off and then into the backflip and landed perfectly without, any issues. But I could definitely feel the weight of the chain is much different than if I wasn't wearing it. And then when I do take it off, it feels like my body is flying, like I have springs in my legs. And all of this is to say, this is the equivalent. This is an analogy of what happens when we are, by choice, eating junk food. And again, look, people can do. You are totally allowed to do whatever you want to do. It's the problem comes in when you start complaining about why can't I get fit? Why am I still fat? Why do I feel sick? Why am I so tired all the time? Why is my energy so low? Because it's the equivalent of carrying around a bunch of weight, and you're doing it unnecessarily. You're not training for anything. Like, what are you training your body for? To be sick and fat and tired? And so the difference is astounding, because I've constantly been my whole life working to dial in what works for me best for my optimum health and how I feel the best. And I found that, and it really just comes down to just excluding most things. There's just a lot of things that I just don't eat anymore simply because there's too many additives, or it's just the way that it's made is just the processing my body doesn't like. So what do I end up eating? I mostly eat just whole, like, leaves, basically. I eat leaves and whole pieces of meat that don't have a bunch of seasoning or bastes or things like that. So it's mostly just kales and chards and what is that other stuff? Spinach and arugula and take all these various different greens and various different nuts like almonds and walnuts and cashews and pecans and all that stuff, and whole chicken breast and turkey breast, and I eat a good deal of honey, lemon juice, and coconut water. Like that pretty much sums up my diet, and coffee. I don't need the variety. Here's the thing about this. I know it sounds radically extreme to a lot of people. And there's so many people who say these things like, well, that's crazy, and it's so radical. Hold on for a second. I got to check on some message. For a security gig. Hold on. Alright, so I just got paid for something, and also know that I'm working the door at this place on Friday night. So what I'm saying, and I've been saying, is that my diet, what I consume, I don't need a lot of variety. Actually, what I was getting to is the point that people might say it's radical and it's crazy and live a little, and you don't know how many times I've heard that, and it's so absurd to me. Because when you are toxifying your body and poisoning yourself and burdening yourself with all of these things, that's not living a little bit, that's dying more quickly. That's not living a little. That's stupid to me. And I hear it so much and so often that it's borderlines on ridiculous, and it makes me think more deeply about this idea of non-player characters. Because there's only so much programming to go around, and people all over the world, literally, in various different countries in the world that I've been in, people say the same exact things and are doing the same exact things and saying the same exact phrases as if it's just part of a program, like we're literally in a simulation. And this live a little. So you're telling me that when I don't want to go to a party because or if I am at a party and I don't want to drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, vape, do drugs, eat cake, ice cream, chips, and all this stuff like that I'm not living a little. I'm tempted to use profanity right now. About when I think about when people say that to me, about how absurd it is. But I'm controlling myself. I'm trying to keep my podcast family friendly, not for any other reason other than just, a much broader reach. And it's a thing that one can do. And it's not even that any words really mean anything. It's just that people, you're uptight. So, fuck it. And so, but the topic, the issue, the point that I'm making here about that is that my desire to be able to experience athletic prowess and athletic longevity, to be able to do these things for a much longer period of time in my life is more important to me than the short-term, sugar high that I might get of some burst of flavor, which is definitely manipulated. I mean, you don't even know how much. Like, fats, sugar, and salts are these ingredients that are researched and studied and manipulated in foods to make them, more addicting. To just use a, shorthand term for what it's really done, just to make things more desirable by people, so people just keep going back and back for more. That's what a lot of this stuff is. It's not engineered or designed for it to be in the most healthy form possible. It's engineered to keep you wanting more and more and more, and to mess with your satiety hormones like ghrelin and leptin, right? Like if you talk about like I was talking about these neuroleptics, which are these antipsychotic drugs. Well, the and leptin means to stop or to seize, right? So leptin is the hormone in your body that makes you feel more satisfied or stops you from feeling hungry. Whereas ghrelin is the one that makes you feel more hungry. And a lot of these foods and in the combinations, they mess with ghrelin and leptin. They make the leptin turn down so that you don't feel as satisfied, and they turn the ghrelin up so that you feel like you want to eat much more. And this is, and I haven't done this research myself or looked in microscopes and done the research with people, but what I do know is that the way that I eat now, very minimalist, is that I feel much better. I have more energy. I don't feel weighed down when I wake up in the morning. I mean, as compared to other times in my life, as compared to when I was eating sugar. I love ice cream. It's so fucking good. And I even tried to get the healthier kinds of ice cream I was looking for. Like there's this one called So Delicious that makes it with coconut milk and whatever, but there's just way too much sugar in it. And I just can't eat just a little bit of it. And so my body it was more difficult for me to get up in the morning. Nowadays when I wake up, I can just shoot up, just bam, ready to wake up, I'm out. I just get up and I start moving around. There's no stiffness in my body. There's no joint pain. I don't have arthritis. I'm not dealing with any limited mobility. All of these things just are completely different. And I noticed the comparison from, before, when I wasn't as deliberate and I didn't filter as strictly, or I even should say didn't practice as much discipline by applying the things that we all know. We all know these things. But we're feeding the machine. We've allowed ourselves to be enslaved by the verifiers. Their intrusion vector has contaminated the earth by hijacking consciousness and forcing us surreptitiously, without our knowing, to become more subservient, to conform, to be compliant, to go along with and do it peacefully. That's what the verifiers want, for us to just peacefully go along with this program, for us to be more compliant. You can imagine just take a sci-fi dystopian trip with me, and that there's a species or a class of maybe humanoid type of beings, but from a different star system, who just by their genetics or however they evolved on their planet have really weak, soft, not very strong bodies in comparison to us. Like, little kids could beat them in, a fist fight. And so the only way that they can invade and take over our planet, these verifiers, is by weakening the human population to a certain extent that through the technology that they have, that when they finally get here, that we are mostly compliant, and they can take over, and they can, trick us with all their flash and their technology and make us think that they're superior, and most of us won't be able to do anything about it. We won't be able to fight because we're too dumbfounded, we're too lethargic, we're just blissed out from all the drugs and alcohol and pharmaceuticals and food, fat, sugars, and things like that we're just easy pickings. They'll just steamroll over us. So, that end of my sci-fi dystopian rant. But you see what I mean? And what if that is the plan of anything? I don't know. I don't really think so. I'm not that bleak and crazy, but I do know for a fact that, at least for my body and for the people who followed along this type of protocol when I have shared it with them, and those who listen, they fare much better. They do much better. They feel much better. And sometimes people do it and they see the promised land, but they somehow go back. And it's interesting to witness. I'm going to move from this area right now and close this up in a little bit, but I'm not seeing the kind of, in this area, the kind of gigs that I want. These things are ridiculous, what I'm looking at right now. So, but that's the overall thesis. Now, I've said it, that's the overall thesis of this dissertation here. And I've said it over and over again in various different ways. But now I'll sum it up and make it concise and share some stories that I've shared many times before, because, as time goes along with experience, literally decades, I've understood the veracity or the truth of it all and just how real what I'm saying is. And so that article, Becoming Superhuman Through Toxin Elimination and Nutrition, was about, for example, Superman. His biology was oppressed on his planet by a red sun, and when he came to Earth, the yellow sun strengthened him, and that's how he was able to have all his abilities, right? And pieces of his planet that were somehow radiated, probably by the red sun, would also weaken him to an extent that it could kill him if he was exposed to it for too long. Sound familiar to what I'm saying, right? And so, and it wouldn't kill him right away, right? But just like everything else, it slowly eats away at our health the longer we're exposed and the closer it is to us. And so, also, and then the other examples I gave from fiction were, there were these fictional beings from this show called the Thundercats, and they were called the Lunatics, and they were from the moons of a planet called Plundar. And the least realistic one I'll say is Chilla, and the moon she was on was cold for some reason. Maybe it was furthest away from the planet and the sun, and maybe it was also in the dark, but for whatever reason she could manipulate moisture and change the temperature to freeze people, or to freeze various different things, the moisture in the air, into objects that she could use as weapons. So she had weaponized hypothermia. Weaponized hypothermia, I guess you could call it, right? And another one that's a little bit more realistic, and was kind of my favorite one, because it has to do with gravitational effects and mass density. But it was this one called Tugmug, who was from a moon that was very dense, and so therefore its gravitational constant was much stronger. So in order for him just to move around normally on that moon's surface, his body composition was more dense and his muscles were more dense and strong, so that when he came to third Earth, he could jump really high And so that was one of his powers, and like use his body to ram into things because of the combination of the density and his leg strength. And then another one I would say is the most realistic, because we have counterparts to that on our planet with insects and animals, was Red Eye. And Red Eye, his moon was completely dark. It was probably always in the shadow of the planet, so he had infrared vision and could see in the dark, and so that was his power. And all of this was happening because they were no longer being oppressed or burdened by the conditions of the planet they were on. And I don't think that I included this example in that blog on hypnoathletics.com, but it's a very valuable one that really drives the point home very well, because regardless of how people feel about, people's degrees or their education, which a lot of times is not very important, and I'm going to talk about how I hijacked my PhD and did something radical with it that wasn't done before, for a very specific purpose, but I'll get to that, not in this particular dissertation, but Dr. Andrew Weil, who's a medical doctor, he wrote this book called 8 Weeks to Optimum Health. And I think in the video series that I got from the Encino Tarzana library, he related a story that was also related to him by another physician, and it was about this river. And this river was polluted by a paper company that set up shop on the bank. And when that happened, the paper company was polluting the river, and when that happened, everything in the river died. All of the plants and animals, all the fish, everything, and all the animals that would come and drink from it, they stopped frequenting that river because it was toxic. And when the paper company left for whatever reason and stopped dumping the effluents and the byproducts from the paper manufacturing into it, without any other intervention, without anybody doing anything, the river came back to life, and all the animals that were living in it and around it came back. And this was without having anything else done, as far as I understand from the story. But that's the part that I'm using. And the analogy is, the human body is the same way, that you don't have to add things to the human body. You simply have to take away the things that are poisoning it in order for your health to improve. That's what I've been saying all along. It's the process of elimination, that in order to become healthier for a lot of people, the thing that we need to start doing through incremental change, and that was part of the 8 Weeks to Optimum Health program as well, was he was saying, 1 day a week, swap something out. That you're, if you're eating, junk food, maybe start to eat fish one day that you cook at home or that you get from a health food store that's already prepared, but just start replacing one of your usually unhealthy, meal items with something that is more healthy. And you just do it little by little until, most of the days of the week, you're eating healthier options, until maybe every day that you're eating are healthier options. And that's it. It's replacing and doing it incrementally, gradually, so that, just like in the same way an addict, sometimes you have to systematically, gradually withdraw, so that the withdrawal symptoms don't cause a lot of issues. Like some things people can stop taking and it can kill them because of the withdrawal symptoms. But in the same way, you want to make a gradual change. And in doing so, and the more motivated it are, the more quickly you can do certain things. But the whole point is that, a lot of times people are going for, like I opened up talking about the perfect corpse. People are out there taking steroids and taking all these crazy supplements and gacking these things down, and now there's all the whole GLP-1 injection craze, and now they have it in a pill, and it's all the thing that anybody can talk about, and you even hear about it in, like, over the loudspeakers of grocery stores, and they're just pushing this so hard. Take this medication, take these supplements, get these steroids, take these drugs, put these vitamins, take this in your body, like it's this potion, it's this mix, it's this blend, it's all this stuff. And the solution really has nothing to do with that. It actually has to do with reduction, elimination. That's how you get healthier. You become very selective about what you're putting in. That's it. It's not a secret. It just seems to be hidden in plain sight because there's so much noise. And you have to be able to discern the signal from all of the noise. And part of what I'm doing here, what I'm saying now, is that very clear signal. I am Hakeem Ali Bokas Alexander.